Remain in the same house, eating and drinking whatever they provide. Do not move about from house to house. With that very odd instruction, Jesus sent 70 associates into the world, 2 by 2. Whether it really happened exactly as reported or not, of all the possible mission directives and disciplines they might have been given, successive generations of believers recalled and recorded this simple instruction: remain in the same house, do not move about. They thought it worthy of remembrance and worth passing on to those who would follow. This strange instruction to remain in one place and not to move from one house to another seems particularly appropriate just now. We Americans are a notoriously impatient lot, and our fuses grow shorter daily. I'm one of the least patient people I know. And despite repeated attempts to conquer this tendency, I remain a toe-tapping, fidgety mess when confronted by any roadblock, no matter how slight or temporary, that gets in my way. It doesn't help one whit that we're programmed to cultivate impatience. The invention of the car altered our concepts of travel and distance, which in turn was challenged and abbreviated by the invention of the train, and then faster and faster airplanes. Telegraph and telephone, radio and television all have played their respective roles in enhancing immediacy and shortening our tolerances. But now we have computers, cell phones, instant wireless communications, smart devices ready to fulfill every command in a flash, and software that anticipates words, email addresses, and websites faster than I can type them into the keyboard, as though it's reading my mind. Technologies evolving far too swiftly in their capacity to work faster and faster and faster, and dragging us along with them. Is it any wonder, then, that we have so little patience with each other, or with God, or with the demanding work of discipleship? We're hardly unique. This human tendency toward impatience is apparent in earlier communities of the faithful. We have only to look at Paul's experience with those believers in Galatia to see its roots. The Galatian congregation was divided into factions. There were converts from Judaism who insisted upon full compliance with the law, including the circumcision of all males, as a prerequisite to full admission into their Christian community. But over against them stood those who demanded that the law be changed, and changed quickly. I suspect the least patient and most outspoken who were demanding change were those Gentile men, especially concerned to get that law changed before circumcision was demanded of them. But after his own angry outburst against the community's excesses, evidence that Paul's fuse wasn't terribly long either, Paul calmly urges patient forbearance. Learn to bear one another's burdens, he says. Gently instruct one another, setting aside judgment of one another until one has taken thorough stock of oneself. Never tire of doing good, he concludes. Now, it's difficult to counsel patience, yet the fabric of our futures is strained by our tendencies to want everything done and over quickly. Every wrong righted yesterday. I confess I'm impatient when policies that guide and instruct our life in the church drag behind changes in the larger society, reflecting a broader tolerance for diversity. And when we do venture to move forward, we're challenged by the weight of traditions and traditionalists. But religious traditionalists are equally prey to impatience, evidenced in knee-jerk reactions to any hint of change, and in the most extreme cases, in some cultures, fomenting terrorism and murderous violence in the name of religion. Secular political structures are in some regards even worse than religions. They manipulate and equivocate, defending the status quo, protecting the interests of wealth, impeding social change with inaction, or conversely, by hasty action and questionable use of executive office, bypassing due process for the sake of political expediency. In recent experience, they attempt to do both simultaneously, drag and hurry. The result is the equivalent of Dr. Doolittle's push me, pull you. That's a fictional creature with two heads at opposing ends of its body. Imagine, if you will, the two-legged front half of the iconic Republican elephant and the corresponding bipedal portion of the Democrat donkey joined mid-torso, facing away from each other, unwilling to coordinate and thus totally unable to move. Cultural, religious, and political systems all over the world pander to human impatience, promulgating suspicion, cultivating fear, promising quick and easy solutions to complex problems, solutions that are mindlessly simplistic and, if enacted, would probably lead only to greater problems. I want change as fast or faster than most. Therefore, I'm challenged by Jesus' admonition that we're to stay put in one house. To stay in one house. To work through the daily difficulties and live as a family. This was the challenge Jesus gave those who were to be entrusted with his life-changing, world-changing gospel. They weren't free to move around. They weren't free to seek better quarters or better food. They weren't free to circumnavigate the difficulties. That instruction applies as much to us today as to any of those who have gone before us. And it seems especially appropriate to this Sunday concluding a long Independence Day weekend and facing into another very long election process. It's a reminder of the responsibilities that come with the freedoms we claim in both church and state. It's an especially timely encouragement and a challenge to those of us who believe that God has made us a family. Like the family into which we're born, the human family into which God has birthed us, tethers us to one another in an inextricable bond of kinship. A reality affirmed each and every time we recite the creeds proclaiming our God and our faith in a God who creates everything that is, seen and unseen, thus making us and all creation part of one vast family. Oh, we're a diverse bunch, to be sure. As Elizabeth Strout notes in her novel, The Burgess Boys, Jim Burgess' life is circling the drain, and he laments to his brother Jim, "I have no family." "Oh, you have family," Bob said. "You have a wife who hates you, kids who are furious with you, a brother and sister who make you insane, and a nephew who used to be kind of a drip, but apparently is not so much of a drip now. That's called family. If we're faithful to the principle that God has made us all of one family and household, then we're not free to move. We're compelled and commanded to remain in one house. We can't turn our backs and leave. We can't tuck our tails and run. We're committed to sticking it out, good times and bad times alike. In her radio program, On Being, host Krista Tippett interviewed songwriter Joe Henry, who reminds that marriage isn't a noun, it's a verb. And his example of marriage extends equally to baptism, that primary Christian sacrament that extends to all our relationships, all those commitments that bind us by blood or promise. Baptism is not a noun, it's a verb. And these relationships aren't once done. We're constantly working to maintain the bonds. No families without strife or pain. And yet those families that endure the trials and work through them attest to the strengthening power that comes of flexing those muscles on a regular basis and keeping them in constant use. That's the time-consuming, energy-sapping, plain old everyday hard work of making a loving life together. The Eucharist remains the ideal God holds before us. It's a momentary vision toward which we struggle, but we have yet to attain. We're not at perfect harmony when we gather around this table. We're not suddenly and miraculously made whole, much less sweet. We're urged to come bearing all the pain, all the difficulty, to taste only briefly that which we long to have always, eternally. Here we bring our separate and often conflicting interests, our strained divisions. But we must put all of that down and empty our hands in order to receive the meal God offers us. We have to lay down the weapons and the tools and stand with our empty palms uplifted. And for a moment, we are vulnerable, dependent upon one another and dependent upon God. For that briefest moment, we enter the mystery of the common table and we become that mystical family God desires us to be always. Being here, staying here, is sometimes the hardest work we do all week. Not because of what it demands of our time, but because of what it demands of our natural and growing tendency to seek a faster, better way. But here we stay in the slow, hard work Jesus commanded of us, eating and drinking what's offered us, working hard at being a family. Amen.